Sorry?
An hour.
Yes. Yes. We don't really Matt, except for being our techie.
Yeah, we're broadcasting now.
After about 55 minutes, if I'm still rambling on, just make some sign of
Will do.
discontent. All right. Can we? We're waiting for the. We're going live on YouTube. I hope that's cool with everybody.
Where's that dog?
What's dog?
The one that changed Richmond Power.
Not
That's what we need.
James.
No,
No, but much more famous than the dog.
What's even better is the dubstep version.
Yeah, we're good?
Yeah.
All right, good evening,
Good.
everybody, and welcome to GRN's Round Table. What's the word coming to? This is the way, this is the name we chose for it. We have here tonight 5 of our great journalists who, during the year, are around the world, putting themselves in jeopardy, making us worry, and giving us terrific service for us and for our clients by telling the world about what's happening in other parts of the world that are less illuminated. I am very glad to have you here tonight. We're going to have a little bit of conversation of what's been happening in the world in 2011, which is about to come to its end. It's also a little bit of a Christmas party for us at GRN. All through the year, we sit and talk to these guys, wherever they are, and we never see them, and we barely know what they look like, and now we're about to find out. We're quite pleased, actually. And we also wanted to celebrate the end of this year that was a very, very interesting, very eventful year all around the world. So we're going to hear from everybody a little bit about the experiences that they had this year and their views of it. How do certain events connect to others? And then you're going to all be welcome to make comments, ask questions, and join the discussion. As you can see, this whole thing is arranged in a very informal way. We really wanted to, rather than have a round table, but we don't even have a table, we wanted to have a circle and to exchange some thoughts and experiences. We have a lot of people in the audience who've been in different places this year, in Syria, in Iraq, in Israel, and in many other places that were hotspots of the year. And also, all of us who didn't get to travel anywhere were in one of the, to our surprise and slight dismay, in one of the hottest hotspots of the year, London. So, yeah, it was quite exciting, actually. I didn't expect it. When I moved to Harringay, I didn't think it was going to end up like this, I can tell you that. We have here tonight, to my side, Rachel Shabi. Rachel has been widely on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and on the Middle East in general for a variety of media, including The Guardian, The Sunday Times, The Independent, the English Al Jazeera, Jane's Intelligence Digest, Foreign Policy, The New Statesman, and The National. I think that's quite impressive. I'm jealous now when looking at this. And she was also shortlisted for the 2011 Orwell Prize for Political Journalism, and she won the unrest Journalism Prize 2011, and she was also nominated for the Next Century Foundation Cutting Edge Media Award. She'd written a book called Not the Enemy about, yes, this was for Rachel and her prizes. She wrote a book called Not the Enemy about Arab Jews in Israel, Israelis who came to Israel from the Middle East, which was fascinating, and I even reviewed it for The Guardian. Favorably. Yes. Well, I didn't know her then, so it's not my fault. And this year she's been in Egypt and in Tunisia. Nick Mayo is a foreign correspondent for the Sunday Telegraph. He covered Afghanistan for The Independent and for The Economist between 2001 and 2005. Were that?
Yes, not all that time, but
on and off. And then he returned to Afghanistan in 2005 to enjoy embeds, the British in the south, and to cover politics in the capital. 2008, he survived a roadside bomb which destroyed a US Army vehicle. That's quite adventurous. This year you were in Oslo and in Libya quite a few times, 5 times, 6 times?
Six times.
6 times in Libya. That's, we're very glad to have you here. It's why we are assuring that you've actually managed to come back from all that. And as I said, your foreign correspondent is the Sunday Telegraph, based mainly in London nowadays. Yes. Christopher Walker, veteran foreign correspondent. You were in the field for the Times for 25 years. Yeah. Running bureaus in Belfast, Jerusalem, Cairo, and Moscow. And I'm your freelance based in London. Chris is GRN's London correspondent. This year, you might have found that this task is more adventurous than we thought. It was quite interesting.
No, I never thought I'd see the Waitrose in Sloane Square being boarded up.
Not the Waitrose.
The Waitrose closing early and leaving it amongst the disgruntled members of the the shopping classes. Was Jean Marsh, who wrote the original Upstairs, Downstairs, and she led a charge up to Partridge's, the Queen's grocers, which remained open, despite the threat of turning mobs who even got as far as Hugo Boss in Sloane Square and beat it down.
You know, only now I'm beginning to realise the magnitude of the events in London, because when I was in Haringey, I was watching our boss burn down.
Haringey, you expect it.
Tottenham going out, only to be normal Saturday night in Haringey. Yeah,
it takes 10 times the rent to avoid it.
Should have moved around. I always wanted to move to shop, of course. I look like I did, but it didn't actually. It was a good money case. She paid for that. Yeah, I did.
Well, you know, in Libya, a few weeks after the riots in London, people were asking me with some concern about what the situation is like.
That's always worrying, isn't it? When I moved to London in 2005, there was the 7/7 bombings, and I remember the Guardian asked me to write an article about what it would be like if this would become a regular thing. I should say, I'm Daphna Baram, I work for GRN as an editor, and I'm an Israeli journalist. So I had the habit of having a bomb in and bomb out when I was news editor for a newspaper in Jerusalem. But once I came here, this was not quite expected. So they were asking me, what would it look like if this would start happening all the time? How would our life change? And I would say, well, you'd start wearing matching underwear.
Well, most of your class were not actually very worried about the suffering of Londoners. They only had one question when you did two wares: what's going to happen to the Olympics?
People were worried about the Olympics. They were definitely not Londoners. Londoners are just nursing a hope that maybe the whole thing will be.
Yeah, well, they were probably by hoping it'll disappear.
I'm going to introduce the rest of our panel. It's Leah Borromeo, who rushed in here a little bit breathless. She's a journalist and a filmmaker. And you worked as deputy foreign editor at Sky News, Channel 4 News, APTN. Yeah, it's true. I was just, you can trust Google, can't you? Among the publications you contributed to are Index and Censorship, and the British Journal of Photography. And you film for NGOs and for social movements, and for factual programs across the developing world, from Haiti to Gaza to Pakistan and Iran. And this year you were mainly in London?
This year I was mainly in London because I've got a commission from Channel 4 to make short films on arts activism.
Alright, so that's quite a lot.
That's lots of fun.
Alright, and finally, last but not least, Tim Judah is a frontline reporter for The Economist and an author, and a graduate of London School of Economics and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And he worked for the BBC before becoming the Balkan correspondent for The Times and The Economist. During the Kosovo War, he broadcasted widely and wrote for the New York news books, The Observer, The Sunday Telegraph, and The Guardian. Tim is also the editor of the prize-winning The Serbs, History, Myth, and the Destruction of Yugoslavia, published in 1997 by Yale University Press. Remember the Balkans? He's a guy, yes. And also Tim this year was in Haiti.
Yeah, that's quite an old biography there, but yes, I am now the Balkans correspondent of The Economist, but this year has been pretty busy. I've been in Haiti, the South Caucasus, I made a program for Radio 4 in Senegal, and of course there's been a lot happening in the Balkans, which is, well, big for Southeastern Europe, but microscopic on the world stage, but it's certainly been a busy year in the Balkans.
It has, and I think, when I was looking at this year a little bit. I wanted to just give you a few highlights. And I'm sure that everybody, what everybody has in mind when you think about this year, I think, is the Arab Spring. Maybe because I'm from the Middle East, this seems to me to be the most biggest event of the year. But I've been looking at a bit of, the internet is full of these sort of calendars of world events, and I've picked a few. And it really makes the head bubble what happened this year. On the 40th of January, the Tunisian government fell. and Mubarak, president of Egypt, resigned on the 11th of February, and the 11th of March there was the tsunami in Japan. 15th of March, a state of emergency was announced in Bahrain. 17th of March, the UN declared a no-fly zone over Libya, and the Libya civil war erupted. 11th of April, Ivory Coast president was arrested, and the crisis in the Ivory Coast erupted. 1st of May, Ben Laden was assassinated. 15th of May, protests in Madrid. Between the 20th and 28th of August, the rebels in Libya took over Tripoli. 5th of September, the India-Bangladesh pact to end some border demarcation disputes there. 12th of September, 100 died in a petrol pipeline explosion in Nairobi. The 19th of September, what is that? Oh, the UN has a 357 million appeal for the floods in Pakistan. 27th of September, Occupy Wall Street. 4th of October, Mogadishu bombings. 283 killed in Thailand floods. 20th of October, Israel and Hamas on the prisoner swap. Israel got back its soldier Gilad Shalit in return for quite a few hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, and for the first time has negotiated effectively with Hamas. You can tell this is close to my heart. 23rd of October, Turkish earthquake. 27th of October, the EU economic pact to tackle the debt crisis, and the whole Eurozone crisis basically became, I think, probably the most influential thing that we at least are feeling here in the last few weeks. On the 31st of October, the world population reached 7 billion. I think that's quite an important landmark. And this week we're all watching Russia with great interest and some horror. I think generally we could say a lot of social disquiet, a lot of civil rebellions, disobedience. The Middle East is definitely coming back into life. Where is it going? We don't know, but I would love to hear a little bit from you. And natural disasters across the board, which I hope Tim's going to be able to tell us about a little bit, having been in Haiti. But I want to throw a question for all the panel. My first question to you, as I said before, what moment for you defines this year more than any other? Which conversation that you had, some visual thing that you've seen, something that you've written, something that you've watched on television, what for you was this year about? Nick, can we start?
Well, I think for me, undoubtedly, it was the moment the crowd in Cairo realised that Mubarak had gone. I'd been in Cairo for about a week, I think, and I was waiting outside the presidential palace. A gigantic crowd of people who were all very, very tired and a bit deflated because their hopes had been raised and then fallen again over the past few days. They were desperate to get him out, but it looked as if he was digging in. And suddenly, I didn't hear any announcement, and I'm not even sure an announcement was made. This extraordinary roar went through the crowd, and people were dancing and hugging each other and shouting. It was so noisy, it was painful. And I've never seen anything like it. It really was absolutely joyous. And then, of course, Cairo became a gigantic party, and there were streams of people driving through the streets, honking their horns and waving flags, and heading into the centre of town, back to Tahrir Square. It was an incredibly optimistic moment and time, and for me, it was an extraordinary event to cover, because it was the first time I'd ever been to Egypt. I spent years in Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan, and these Muslim countries that are very, very troubled and are now very pessimistic about their future. And there was this extraordinary moment of optimism. For me, that's the memory. That's my main memory from 2011.
Chris.
Well, I think it's got to be, I was in St Paul's in July when, believe it or not, despite my own checkered past, my son was ordained and became a vicar. And it was an incredible day, and the bells were pealing, and the sound. And then to be exactly back there only a few months later, to find it looked like a sort of reminiscent of Glastonbury, with blue tents all over the floor, people with their sort of knickers hanging up, drying, strange sort of cooking going on, and a fierce argument throughout Britain, in which, to begin with, it rather looked as though this disparate bunch of revolutionaries who were definitely influenced psychologically, if not openly, by the Arab Spring, had sort of lost, as the only people who resigned were three churchmen, where not a single banker was moved in any way, though some of them made very rude remarks to them from the upper floors of their city institutions. And then suddenly, the pendulum, as it does, swung again. They have not been got rid of. And everybody thought when the Americans went through to their Occupy Wall Street camps all over with the heavies, they'd get rid of them in St. Paul's, but not a thing of it. And what happens, we switch on the radio this morning and find out that nobody less than the head of the city's financial regulation authority is sitting in one of these blue igloos having an intense discussion with 10 of these people who've been described by Boris Johnson, the directly elected mayor, as a load of crusties, about the future of the regulation of city life. And they were destined to have more conversations, and nobody, frankly, can see how they're going to leave. And they're going to, if it's not unlikely, become as much a part of London for the tourists as the pigeons in Trafalgar Square, because people, although they have arranged to let people into the church, they are very, very able to argue their case, some of it with entire lack of logic, and some of it rather well. They defy any rigid definition. They're not all sort of crusty hippies or rugged. Some of them are housewives who come all the way from Sheffield or something. And I think that must be the image as we have the Christmas bells ringing out.
That's very interesting because basically Nick was talking about a victory in the Middle East, in a place where there was trying to be so much oppression, whereas in London it seems to be that a very, very long process doesn't necessarily manage to get.
No, well, I think it's a sign that when Egypt does hopefully get to democracy, democracy is a very difficult way of life. As Churchill said, it's the least worst way of running a country, because nobody really dares. I mean, you all know you could get rid of those tens of... We could probably get rid of them tonight if we went down there. But nobody dares because of the backlash that would promote the image.
And why would you want to get rid of them?
Why would I?
Yes.
Me?
Yes.
I think they're an eyesore, and I think they're a complete affront to our way of life. I think
And what way of life is that?
the way of life is one of the most successful countries in the world.
In what way?
For who? Well, the
Okay, we're going to open
99%, the 1% are in the tents.
I never thought the volume was going to wrap around London. That's quite interesting. But well, yeah, could you give us your? You've been covering London this year. Could you give us your moment?
Should we just go in order? And then
No, we're going. This is the order. We're going to the
fantastic, an actual working democracy, which is much closer to anarchism. But defining moment. A very good friend of mine runs something called Russell Tribunal on Palestine, and he had a son born this year called Leo. Now, when Leo was conceived, it was last year. The world was still very much in flux, and all those events that happened. You know, nobody would have thought Bin Laden would have been captured in this random town what's about where, ironically enough, I was about 3 months before he was captured, and if I knew he was there, I'd pop out and have a tea, but nobody bothered to tell me. An interesting fact about is when you drive in, it's a fantastic sign in Urdu that says, "Welcome to the Lady Garden." I pissed myself going in there. What the hell? And the driver's like, "It says Lady Garden." I mean, you have no idea what that. But I digress. But Leo's birth means that he's born in this world of complete and utter flux, and nobody can say what it's going to be like in 2012. No one's going to say what it's going to be like when he first sits the exams, when he first learns to speak, when he becomes an adult, when he starts defining and starts exploring his own political views, and obviously having parents that kind of run something like the Russell Tribunal kind of know where they would come from anyway. But one of the best things about the fact that this whole world is in flux, and I wrote it down, is, and the one thing that actually sticks in my mind is the power of revolt and the power of dissent, and that nothing will ever change unless people say no.
That was a good moment. Yeah. Tim, what did you see?
Well, I saw plenty of things, but I have been thinking about what was this particular moment, and I think this particular moment was not quite as dramatic as any of the things that we've heard already. In the Balkans, a lot of things have happened this year. For example, earlier this year we had the capture of General Ratko Mladic, who's been indicted for the death of, or for the murder, I should say, of up to 8,000 Bosniaks at the end of the Bosnian War. But that wasn't it. It was about 3 weeks ago in northern Kosovo, which is a Serbian-controlled area, and the whole of northern Kosovo has, since July, been cut off with barricades because people there are saying no to the state of Kosovo. And I went to one of these barricades, and it was night, and it was actually quite surreal because you had this road which was cut off, and it was a barricade built with lorries full of gravel and buses. It had been built by Serbs because they want to stop Kosovo government officials getting to the border to become customs officers and police officers. Quite strangely, rather surreal, was the fact that we had there were German soldiers, NATO soldiers, standing on top of the barricade. But okay, I'm not 100% sure how they got there. I think it was a clash. They had taken half of it or something. They were sort of staring down at the Serbs on the other side, who were just keeping themselves warm with these braziers. And it was night and cold, and I was asking the local Serbs who were manning the barricades, all these kind of big hulky chaps who actually had incidentally been put up on their buses pictures of General Mladic, which shows a little bit about where they were coming from. Anyway, the point is, I was saying, well, you know, what would it take you to take the barricades down? If the Serbian government did this, would you do that? And it was like, no, never. So anyway, we had this kind of just a regular interview. And at the very end, they clustered around and they go, now, we will ask you a question. Oh, okay, so I'm slightly worried about this because sometimes people can get, well, as we all know, as correspondents can get quite aggressive. They go, did you think that Greece, when do you think Greece will go bust? And what about Italian debt? And if things are so bad in the EU, why are we Serbs trying to join? So I thought that was actually kind of a defining moment for me, that even in this kind of rough and tumble barricade down in northern Kosovo, they're worrying about the European future.
I know. We should work more.
Yes.
Yeah. Rachel.
Mine was Tunisia. I was there for the elections in October, and it was just randomly, I was on the streets interviewing people in the old city of Tunis the day before the elections, just saying to people, you know, how are you going to vote? What's going to happen on voting day? And it turned out that it was going to be like an Eid, like it was a really special day. And there was one woman that I spoke to. She was 57, and she said, you know, she's getting ready. She's gone to the hairdresser. She's going to go to the hammam, the Turkish baths. She's got a special dress to wear, and you know, she's not going to be able to sleep all night because she wants to like be there at the election booths first thing 7 a.m. to vote. And she starts crying, like just at the thought of it, and just is completely overwhelmed with what that means. And I think it just hit me there as a really sort of visceral moment of what that would mean for somebody who's 57 and goes to the election booth for the first time with a feeling of, I matter, this counts, you know, after decades of feeling that repression and that fear. And, you know, it took me a while when, back in January, I'd just come out of Israel-Palestine, and I was, like a lot of people, watching what was going on in Egypt. Wasn't there, but I was watching it on Twitter. And it took me a while for this idea to sink in of, you know, what I'd known of the Arab street, just being in Palestine, Egypt and Jordan and other places, was a place that was very defeated and submissive and tired and, just fed up of being caught up in a sort of geopolitical game where it was a pawn and over which it had no influence or sense of control. And suddenly, at the start of the year, we get the Arab street where it's a place of empowerment, and Arabs suddenly it's like they're cool, they have a sense, and protest counts, and there's a reclamation of public spaces that have before been, a theatre of repression and abuse. The Arab public spaces are suddenly a place of people power and control. So I think that all sort of somehow crystallised when I saw that woman break down in tears in Tunisia, the prospect of voting for the first time.
I think.
Can I just ask on that? I've heard it said that the Arabs themselves don't like the Western term, the Arab Spring,
No.
prefer something else. Can you tell us
Well,
about
uprising with
Uprising,
many
awakening.
conditions, with,
that?
Use stronger terms in the Middle East.
It's a classic Orientalist construct. The Arab Spring as it's something that we apply when we're looking.
Yes, but is spring anyway possibly one of our concepts, not theirs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
The whole idea of spring, I think, in the Middle East, is getting hot, it's going to be hotter, and we're not sure that this is going to be so enjoyable for most of us, for the rest of you. But I think most of you have. Would you like to ask a question?
Me?
Yes.
No,
No.
I'm good. Thanks.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's fine. I think most of you have touched on different centres of social disquiet around the world, mainly what we've seen in the Arab Spring and what we've seen in Europe this year. I think the thing that strikes me most about this is I think we were all born, I assume, in the 20th century. In the sorry, Rachel.
I'm saying so we're all
Just, but
in the age of ideologies, we've all seen the walls come down in the end of the 80s. We are seeing now a bunch of very, very strongly convinced and strong-willed demonstrators and protesters around the world rising, whether they are in Europe, in America, or in the Middle East. And there are a lot of differences between them, as you started mentioning. But I think I was very
meanwhile, the
moved.
politics is going right.
Yeah, and the politics and the established politics in Europe. Anyway, yeah.
You're going to have Sarkozy probably winning, despite the odds, if he can sort out friends with his fellow
So established policies going more
right.
right.
You've already had right-wing gaining in Scandinavia. In Britain, despite all the sort of cock-ups of the coalition, look at the polls. Labour just can't get away. It's only 2 points in it, which is amazing after.
But is the street, while all the ruling class is going right, is the street going left? What is the cry? What is the cry of the
I
street?
don't think it's right and left anymore. It's just this. We're not. It's not defined in political terms of left and right anymore because those ideologies are broken down. It's just people being pro-democracy and saying we count. We don't like the way that you're running this country. We don't think you're in any way representative or accountable.
But all they've got out of it is
it's more like about democracy than about
No,
ideology.
there's a growing sense of entitlement, and there's also a growing sense that we're not going to take shit anymore.
But all they've got out of it so far is 2 unelected prime ministers, who are Monti and the Greek one who are going to save the day, who've never stood for election in anything at all.
Well,
The elected ones have been tossed like Berlusconi out of the window, called buffoons and thrown away.
It's the opposite of democracy. That's the opposite of democracy.
Yes, so what you're getting actually, to say that the people have achieved anything.
that wasn't their idea.
Why do you say they're the people? They're about maximum 5,000 in Greece throwing rocks. It's only because of the TV screen and the Twitter and the such like that they're getting magnified. They really are not. They haven't shown themselves in one poll.
So you're saying the masses are complacent, and they just rather sit over the cup of tea.
Well, the masses have always been
And they
complacent.
just deal with being
They're not the masses. Have you been on a march in London? You couldn't say it's the masses. The only one that was possibly was the trade union march. That was organised by the Union, not supported by the main left-wing party.
And there was one around which contained quite a few million in 2003.
Yeah.
2 million.
Yeah. That was quite massive.
That was quite
The margin for the war was quite massive.
Here.
Yeah.
Yeah, what effect did it have? Absolutely nil.
But that's why
So
we
there's no point in protesting, there's no point in dissent.
And there's no point in that sort of dissent if you're not going to
So
express
essentially,
it
just
democratically.
sit back and let the man.
But this is a democratic expression. This is a democratic protest. How is this not a democratic expression?
But it's only left-wing.
I mean, there are
obviously,
I mean, arguably the most truly revolutionary figure, or the two most truly revolutionary figures in the world would happen to be still Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, because they are the ones who actually changed the way things have been run, and they have totally and utterly affected the way we are now. One of the reasons why we are so fucked is because of them.
Well, that's your view. A lot of people say that's the one reason we're getting rid of the trade unions who crippled our life for many years, wrecked Fleet Street, and is that Margaret Thatcher actually stood up against them.
So so being part of a union is basically a bad thing?
Well, it's not a bad thing, but it's not particularly helpful to the well-being of the state before they
Okay,
go.
hang on. I think I was totally wrong in asserting that this argument has gone away from the world, because it's obviously still here sitting with us in the way that we analyse the events. Just coming back, yeah.
I'm concerned about protests in the way protest has gone in Egypt and in the Middle East, actually. Although when I was in Cairo in February, as I said, it's terrific optimism about what had happened. And the young protesters were real Democrats, nearly all of them that I met. They knew what democracy was and they wanted it. And there were a lot of Muslim brothers actually in Tahrir Square. They said they wanted democracy as well. And I think after Mubarak's downfall, people knew that they would have a difficult time constructing democracy, but they were buoyed up by what they've achieved. Last Saturday I was in the office, not in Cairo, but reading the wires, and the first results coming through from the Egyptian election, and they're deeply worrying. The Muslim Brotherhood is coming out looks as if it's coming out as the biggest party. It looks as if the Muslim Brotherhood is going to have a very big part to play in the new Egypt. That won't concern too many Egyptians. They're used to the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is by and large fairly moderate, although it's also in flux at the moment.
I'm just used to them, they've elected them.
But what about the Salafists?
Well, that's what's really concerning. The Salafists have a very big showing in the election. I don't think anyone expected
Go
that.
on, tell us about the Islamists, because I don't understand.
Sorry, these are very extreme Islamists.
Yeah, but are they sympathisers with other extremists?
Well, I think most of them would say that they're not sympathisers with Al-Qaeda.
They're more like the Taliban lines. They wouldn't, for instance, allow women. They wouldn't allow women to appear. They wouldn't allow women to appear on their election posters because the face of a woman can't be seen. So they just replace them with flowers. They don't want.
Well, they do.
In Jerusalem, it's fine.
Well, we'll just
Can I just say about I mean, because there's been an awful lot of, like, you know, every single article since the elections, both in Tunisia and in Egypt, have been, oh my God, the scary Islamists are coming, they're going to take over the world. And the thing about it is that, obviously, Islamist parties in the Middle East are, you know, the counter to the former repressive regimes who are associated with secularism, corruption, repression. The Islamist parties have a clean slate in that regard, so they're seen as the counter to that. And the point about them is that they are an unknown at the moment. We don't know what they're going to be like in government. They need to be given the chance to succeed, but they also need to be given the chance to fail, and we need to trust that these democratic processes will hold them to account if they do fail.
What lessons do they draw from the last 10 years?
Well, they've been in hiding and
Yes, I know. What lessons do they draw from the actions of comparable groups?
Well, a lot of them will cite the Turkish example as the model of an Islamist party that is nonetheless the head of a secular nation. And a lot of the Islamists I spoke to, both in Egypt and Tunisia, were very pragmatic.
But you have to distinguish between Salafists and the Islamic Brotherhood.
Which is why I'm talking about
that's what I want to know.
the majority in both Tunisia and Egypt.
The sense, what are they called in Tunisia?
Ennahda, the Ennahda party. And they're very, they seem practically neoliberal in their economics. They seem very keen to assure that they are friends of the West, that they're not going to, revoke any treaties that the West considers significant. In the case of Egypt, the peace treaty with Israel. They are very keen to present themselves as pluralistic. They don't want to damage women's rights. Now, we don't know whether any of that is true when they are in government, but the point is that they will only be a part of government. They are not at the moment parties that are going to be a majority of those governments.
The coalition.
They will be in coalition, and everybody that I spoke to in both Egypt and Tunisia was very confident about, well, you know what, if we don't like them, we're going to hold them to account. We're not going to let them do things we don't like. So, we do have to, a little bit, sit back and trust a democratic process to work.
But I think the danger is my fixer, the young Egyptian woman who was translating for me in February, actually started off as a protester in Tahrir Square. She was being shot at in Tahrir Square before I arrived. She's left Egypt now. She's in America. But she's very worried about what's happening in Egyptian politics. She's worried about the role of the military. And she's very worried about the Islamists. And I think what's so concerning for people is they more or less know what the Muslim Brotherhood is, and I think most of the Arab countries have got something like the Muslim Brotherhood. It's Islamists who are fairly moderate. They're quite familiar, and I think most Egyptians can live with that, even though they may be wary of the Muslim Brothers, and may be wary about their rules for women, for example. But there are, the extremists are a different matter, and it looks as if they're going to have much more influence over Egypt than anyone thought. I think it was about 20%.
It went down in the runoff though this week. They actually.
What's the relationship between the Islamists and the army?
Well,
it's been this very strange marriage of convenience. The Muslim Brotherhood has been repressed for years, and now in some kind of partnership with the army, it looks as if it's going to, perhaps take over the running of the.
Are they trying to hold the ring while democracy grows, or are they trying to keep the control they had before? Yeah.
Well, there are a lot. I think the army's real motives are still in doubt. I mean, you had this extraordinary situation where you had almost a coup d'etat with the army taking power after a popular uprising, possibly taking power unwillingly. Well, that's what they would say. They would say they wanted to keep order, but nobody's quite sure whether they do want to.
Who's holding the ring in Tunisia?
Well, just to go back to the military council in Egypt, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that their motives are to hang on to as much power as they possibly can. I mean, in the sort of 8-10 months since they have taken over the running of Egypt in the interim period and the transition before the elections, they have only made things worse. They have not done anything that has been remotely democratic. There are 12,000 protesters who have been subjected to military trials, which is more than Mubarak managed in 30 years of rule. Nobody has been called to account. Nobody.
Do they not see the paradox? Or not?
Who's they?
What's
the army?
Well, their job.
I mean, they're the brothers and cousins and uncles and the people in the street.
Yeah, but the army has very, very deep roots in Egypt, and it has very, very deep pockets in Egyptian society as well. It owns a lot of the factories and means production. It has a lot of control, and it is very unwilling, not surprisingly, to give that up, because who wants to give up control? Nobody does it willingly.
And arguably, they're the ones that are most suited, apart from some other organisations, to take over from Mubarak, because they already had that infrastructure. And so when things are in flux, when things are in chaos, once you've already got this kind of ready Lego-style kit of an organisation.
Well, whoever wins, they'll still want an army, won't they?
Sorry?
Whoever wins, they'll still want an army.
But they won't want an army.
They might not want to join it.
Yeah.
We have another question from the audience. Could you introduce yourself in any way you choose?
I'm just I'm Middle Eastern. And I just have an issue with what has been discussed at length of the point of the sort of scare of Islamism in the Arab world. I mean, actually, basically, it has been in the literature for decades already. I mean, basically since the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War and all of that, everything you read was about like the scary Islamism, and it has been right, but it has been because of, let me just please put my point through. It has been because of different variable. If give me injustice, I'll give you extremism of any kind. It was easier for people to identify with some sort of identity when everything, because of the collaboration of dictatorship, international situation, fail of ideologies, people found in certain countries themselves more identifying with Islam as a solution because they needed solution. Right now, if we move to 2011, it was a surprise what happened when it started in Egypt. And after Tunisia, everyone was like, all right, it's just like an odd phenomenon that won't be repeated. It started in Egypt, everyone was like, it's not going to continue. It started in Syria, everyone was like, for months, people would say, la, it's going to stop. No, it cannot actually continue. And you'd be surprised. This is not about any ideology. Actually, if you know this one phenomena across the Arab world, that it's leaderless. It's actually leaderless. It's question of dignity, work, life. You've got the internet, you've got television, you see people living, you want that, and you have a population that is mostly young. So say that they get voted because they organized, okay? The biggest dictator of the Middle East has always been Allah, basically. The dictatorship across the Arab world has closed down everything but the mosque. So all the secularists have been thrown into prisons in the 80s. You can't close down the mosque. When you get any opening, the easiest way of networking is for the mosque. And this sort of connection is there. So it's easier for them to present themselves now into election. Say they vote, get voted in, say they win a government. Do you think if they actually don't answer electricity, bills, water, dignity, public services, jobs, prosperity, any of that, they, as she had mentioned actually, they have been restless in assuring that we're all for plurality, we're all for pluralism, we're all for civil society, we're all for women's rights, and they'll get voted out. And if not, people are going to take out to the street. Once you die, you mentioned an experience of someone who's running from bullets. We all across the Middle East had to run from bullets at some point, whether you're a journalist or just a normal protester, it happens. Once you're faced with that, unless you get to where you are, where you want. So do you think the West is not falling into its own path of, let me choose a careful word here, and into its own sort of traditional patterns of thinking about, like, there's the Islamist and there's nothing else?
What I've been told several times in the past few months is America's quite happy to deal with Islamists.
Yeah, it is. That's why it's not finished revolution in Egypt.
America doesn't have a problem with dealing with this, and they recognise that the Middle East is changing. The old dictators, their day is over. There are going to be new governments in the Middle East, and if Islamists are democratically elected, you know, that's fine. And anyway, I suspect a lot of Western politicians don't really care who's in control as long as the oil flows and the terrorism stops. But I think we do have to be a little bit careful with these protests in the Middle East, not to be too optimistic about them. What happened in February and March was incredibly inspiring and incredibly brave, of course, and I'm sure we all hope that the real democracy is going to take root. And I think many people in the Middle East do as well. There's no guarantees of that. Libya as well. I mean, Libya's had a happy ending. It looks to me as if Libya is progressing towards some kind of successful democracy, but there's still militias on the streets.
Nick, Libya has been under a suppressive regime for 4 decades. So we have to give them some days. I mean, it's been like a couple of weeks. Okay, that's one thing. Second thing, I think the argument has been used here by you and Chris, that the phobia of Islamism. It's the same exact argument being used by...
No, it's not. I know what you're saying. Mubarak used...
No, sorry. Let me finish the subject. Let me finish the point. I'm sorry. Mubarak, just before he left, like 2 weeks before, and I read, my name is Hoshang, and I do freelancing for Arabic newspapers in Middle East, Hayat and Safir, and some other newspapers. Just two weeks before Mubarak left, he had that that terrifying speech about if I go, that Islamism will ruin the whole country. The same exact argument has been used by Abdullah Saleh when he says, if I go, Qaeda will take over the country. The same exact argument has been used by Bashar al-Assad. I'm shocked that Syria is not on your list, Daphna.
So my list?
No, it's not. It was not. So Bashar is using the same exact argument that if I go. The other thing is I want to ask. I'm from Middle East. I've been living in the States for about 10 years, but I've been raised in the Middle East. I've been raised in Iraq. The thing is, we always, and I'm from the leftist family, so I've been always. Everybody was terrifying me about Islamism. If they go, they will eat us alive. I mean, and you mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood. I think they are the weakest groups right now in Syria and in Egypt. Why? Because they've been banned in Syria. They've been banned since actually the constitution of Syrian constitution states very clearly any affiliation with Muslim Brotherhood, that's execution. You get execution. So what I'm saying is, I think if you mention Salafism, I would agree with you. Actually, Salafism is much more powerful than Muslim Brotherhood right now. But it's just people are getting. The thing is how you look at the whole situation between. And I'm sorry to say that I divide that Western view towards the whole situation and the Eastern citizen and a Syrian citizen or a Libyan citizen or an Egyptian citizen. They say, as Nawar mentioned, it's not about democratic or anything, it's about dignity. I do exist, and it's enough, and it's no to 4 decades of suppression. So I don't think the argument's been used by Islamism, it's not working over there. And people say, every Egyptian, they knew that Muslim Brotherhood will win. But we'll give them 4 years, 8 years, we're going to build the country. That's what I think the argument that says over there.
Can I take one more comment from the rest, then we'll front east?
I thought this conversation was about to develop in a more interesting way. I thought Rachel introduced it, and actually you just picked up on one aspect of it, so maybe it will develop in a more interesting way. I'm thinking about 1989, which is the last time I had the same feeling that I've had for most of the course of this year. I've been around for about 40 years observing this stuff. And in 1989, we watched value systems break down incredibly fast in the same way that value systems have been reforming incredibly fast over the course of the last year. And we have not been using the words left and right because they don't, as Rachel said, mean anything anymore. But the two words that have come into common currency during the course of the last year, 2 years, are the two words disenfranchisement and elites. And somehow, what I am observing, and this is why I say that I thought it might develop in a more interesting way, because we've been talking about the Arab Spring, the Middle East, the Arab Spring, whatever. Actually, I think what we may be seeing the beginnings of in Russia the day after tomorrow, when something that nobody could dream of happening 5 years ago with Putin, people collecting onto the streets, troops having to be brought out of them and so on. I think that this opposition between a globalized disenfranchised, if you like, and a globalized elite. The globalized elite have the world's money markets to support them. The globalized disenfranchised have Twitter and Facebook. And somehow, to me, at the moment, that opposition, it's there in St. Paul's Church, that opposition is actually what is beginning to define the last 18 months.
I want to take this just for a second to ask Tim, because you mentioned the people in the Balkans sitting on the fence as you've always been looking at Europe and saying, what's happening to them? Are they falling apart? We've been now talking about the risk, thinking, what's happening to them? There may be some space for optimism. What's happening to Europe is to define itself as though we are looking at them, and how do we judge what's happening to them? Or at this moment, with the sense of disintegration?
Well, actually, I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to tell you something else, because it's something that I'm going to slightly change the subject. I'm going to do a very, very small in this kind of huge stuff happening in the Arab Spring, here's just one tiny anecdote, which I think which will lead to a rather bigger question. Albania is obviously a very small country. It actually has historical links with Egypt. The royal family of Egypt before 1956 were originally Albanian, but that's beside the point. After the financial crisis began in 2008, there are 100,000 people in Albania who work in textile factories, putting together the things that we're wearing, probably, amongst others. And after 2008, there was a lot of the demand, especially from companies in Italy and Greece, which was their main markets, began to fall. So they were very worried about this 100,000 people. And so as demand began to fall, they began to think, well, where are we going to find the business to keep these people working? And guess where all the business is coming from? From all those people who used to make their clothes in North Africa. North Africa, obviously, if you're making clothes for Marks and Spencer's or wherever it is no longer a reliable place. So those Albanians are all doing fine, thank you very much, because they earn probably the same as people would have earned in North Africa, maybe a little bit more, but not very much. They're closer to the markets anyway, and they're all doing fine because they've picked up business from North Africa. So my big question is, it's fine to make Islamists and secularists and this, that, and the other, but it's going to be jobs in the end. And one of the problems is that you've got this demographic bulge of all this 20-year-olds who don't have jobs, but are Islamists or anyone else going to be able to create jobs, especially since, as I said, this tiny anecdote means jobs are going out.
And doesn't this, together with the comment that we just had, returns us back exactly to these same concepts that you said were not existing anymore of left and right? What is the difference between the new disenfranchised and the old alienated? What is the difference between the new elites and the old business? What is the difference between the lack of work and between the unemployment? I mean, is this really a new world, or does it really mean that in the existence of religions that there's always been Islam, there's always been radical Christianity, there's always been Judaism there, then there's always been class war there. Has it gone anywhere?
Can I just talk about, because you brought up something that I thought was really interesting, and it does connect to what we were talking about earlier, in that if we're talking about elites, then clearly we have to accept that the media is a part of that elite. And I think that the media this year has done us we have realised that the media has done us a disservice. When those uprisings erupted onto the streets of the Middle East, it was clear that we knew nothing about the Middle East. I heard from colleagues who work in newsrooms, surprise at, oh my God, those women in Egypt, they're not hijab, like they're not veiled on the streets, protesting like what? And they speak English. You know, it just showed us how disconnected we have been from reporting that story in the Middle East, which clearly has been bubbling up for decades, and which clearly we have been complicit in, propping up these repressive rulers and not really caring what the consequences were for the people on the street.
Well, I don't think it's fair at all to say that the media is part of the elite.
Well, okay, but let me just finish this thing.
What do you mean by that?
Seriously?
Yeah.
Which part of the media?
When I go and report in Libya or Egypt or anywhere else, I'm not writing a piece for the Barclay brothers. So I'm writing a piece for all the readers.
No, okay. Well, let's just stick to this point then of how unrepresentative we were of what was going on in the Middle East. Had we been paying attention, for instance, we would have realised how important trade unions are to organisation in the Middle East, and we would have realised that far from being irrelevant, actually they were instrumental in bringing about the revolution.
But I think we realised how important the army was, and that's been proven.
That's distracting from what I'm trying to say, which is that these movements have been building up for a long time. The Egyptian revolution did not just spark like that. It built on the momentum of civil rights and trade unions organising for years, massive protests everywhere else. Yeah, and now we're beginning to join the dots because all the protests that we've had on the streets of how many countries all this year have been connected. They've been cross-pollinating and cross-fertilizing. We've seen the influence bounce from one to the other. We've seen the Spanish protesters state that they were influenced by the Arab revolution.
Mainly because of what they've seen on the media.
We've seen
that Sky Television, CNN, BBC, where the shops have shown them what was going on in Spain and let them know what's going on in Greece. There's nothing very elitist about that. If it wasn't for the media, frankly, in Al Jazeera #1, I don't think there's any way that the Arab Spring, or whatever we call it, would have taken place. In fact, you know that that's the change that's come now. The Arabs never had their own free network. The Qataris don't keep it particularly free, but as long as you don't cover what's going on in downtown Doha, you can get away with it.
Saudi Arabia.
Well, to a lesser extent, I think people know what's going on in Bahrain. They've seen it.
Just about Al Jazeera.
It wasn't covered. It wasn't covered for political reason. It wasn't covered as much as it should have been in Bahrain, and it continued.
Nobody
watched Shout at the Darkness that just won a Foreign Press Association award. If you don't think Al Jazeera covers Bahrain, as someone who was involved in it, I can tell you, watch Shout at the Darkness. But you're right about news coverage. On the Arab side, it was.
Yes,
it was much less aggressive.
Yeah, and that clearly was a sort of watch and learn moment.
I mean, Syria, without the bravery of certain journalists, not to say nothing, of course, of the private, the civilian journalists who we don't, seem to be calling as journalists. But I mean, they're doing journalism. They're just transmitting their footage to the bigger lot who can't get in there. If it wasn't for the bigger lot, it'd be no good having 1,000 little films on a mobile phone and handing them around at a meeting. They've got to get them to the offices of CNN, get them to the offices of Sky,
but for the first 2 months in Syria, for the first 2 months in Syria, no one actually covered it. There was a political will of everyone not to cover it. Everyone thought it's going to die. Everyone thought it's such a political, sensitive story that no one wanted to actually just get involved in the middle of it. Syrian people died for 2. I'm just answering the example you gave from Syria. No one wanted to cover it for 2 months until Al Jazeera Arabic picked it up. And people and citizen journalists actually in Syria are better than a lot of very seasoned journalists. You would see a 22-year-old or a 24-year-old running around covering the story, although he knows nothing about journalism, because people died for months. For 2 months, almost 3, people were dying in the street. And had it not proved itself to continue, no one was interested. Even now, and if you talk about Bahrain, across the spectrum, people have been, they drove over them in cars. Eventually, we all know how it works, but it wasn't covered. Not even the Arab press wanted to cover it.
But isn't this the critical issue that you just mentioned, which is citizen journalism has gone exponential as a result of the ability of people to upload from mobile phones onto third-party internet sites. This is the transformational element. And us, not so much me, I'm not a foreign journalist, but most of you, have had your role taken over from the street level up. And that's
people have taken up all the panel and opportunity. Sorry. Yes. We're going to have this point about the citizen journalism because I'm really interested in getting your take, and then we're going to talk about the future. Okay. So this is the plan.
Can I make a comment on this? On this point about the media being part of the elite, as I think my colleague on the panel said, I'm quite concerned about this actually, because I think we live in a sort of an age of distrust. People distrust the banks, they distrust politicians, they distrust all kinds of institutions, and they're right to do so. But I hear lots of criticism like this, sort of rather loosely thrown around about the media. you know, papers like mine, of course, they're owned by rich people. There are lots of columnists who have very, very right-wing views. It's clear that it's a column and that's their views. But the reporting is not slanted towards any elite anywhere. It's pretty balanced. It's as balanced as we can make it. And I think it's really important that people do trust the media. And it concerns me a lot, especially the media in this country, in Britain, is very good. Now, I think British people get an excellent quality media. There are plenty of problems at the lower end, certainly with the tabloids. I'm not talking about them. But it worries me quite a bit when people question what they're getting from the media like this, especially after spending a lot of time in the Middle East this year. All the conspiracy theories that proliferate in the Middle East all the time, all the distrust about information. I think people are incredibly lucky in this country to have the media they've got for all its problems. And it worries me quite a bit when you have criticism, mostly from people on the left, sort of, you know, loosely.
Oh no, I think you've got it. If you dish it out, you've got to take it. I mean, it shouldn't worry you at all. There's always been whingers, you know.
Nick, I don't think that in this year, with the eruption of the whole News International scandal, we can sit here and say, you know, we expect the people to trust us just because we do. I mean, you know, we open some.
No, I see.
The media is an elite because it is a go-to.
Well, it's the fourth estate.
Hang on. You go to the newswire, you go to AFP, you go to Reuters, you go to AP, you think, okay, these people must have checked this bit of information out corroborated against 2 or 3 different sources, and then you go off and churn away into papers on Newsline scraps or anything else, and people will consume this media and try to assume that it is fact. So one of the classic things, there's a way people sort of manipulate the media in that way, because when they said that Saif Gaddafi was captured and caught, etc., and it was splashing all over the other tickers, and they went, oh, hello, and then suddenly it was, oh, no, I'm not, I'm here. And so you could no longer trust that level of...
Oh, come on, that's
come on, William Hague said that Gaddafi had run to Venezuela. You can't blame the media.
That's making your point, and I guess
the point is, people believed it because the media was an authority, because it is an elite.
No, I don't understand your point at all.
No,
I mean, we get some factual things wrong. Libya was an incredibly difficult story to cover.
Because what about Le Monde in France, that's owned by itself?
But you're saying that the media wasn't an elite.
We didn't believe it.
Well, it's a party, it's the fourth estate. It's
what does
part,
that mean?
Well, you know, the first fourth estate means it's part of the ruling in any country. That's the institutional media. Completely new is the Twitter and the civilian journalism, but that in its own way is less checked. I agree with you that it is very disappointing. And I know, and you know from working, that only Reuters checks twice. We used to say if you see something coming from AFP, you don't touch it with a barge pole. It's probably a janitor, a street sweeper, who speaks French. I mean, but Reuters does double check, and they miss the news. I mean, often Reuters limps in like an old horse in the Derby, but when it limps in, it's got 4 legs, you know, the 2 that won. I do remember so much that thing about Gaddafi having fled to Venezuela. It was such a load of rubbish, but it was Haig that was responsible.
Yes,
and it's very hard to blame the media when the foreign secretary of a leading country tells you something to say, oh no, Mr. Haig's a dribbling baby, you know, we won't listen to him. He hasn't got any hair. But
the thing about elites, though, is that actually what I was talking about, I was actually trying to join the dots of the protest dots, and what I was really wanting to mention here was 1, Occupy, and 2, trade unions, because when we saw the trade union strike, the public service workers strike last week, or 2 weeks ago about pensions, try and tell me that the media is not elite when you see all the headlines in the British press about that strike. They're completely worthless, they have gold-plated pensions. I mean, the level of animosity...
Well, what's wrong with that? It's a fact.
Well, yes, but...
Oh my God!
closed house.
The second point about that is that, you know, when you look at the Occupy movements and the fact that, again, this is something that has been completely tarnished by mainstream media, completely trying to discredit this movement, both in the States and in the UK.
And what about in France?
Clearly, there are interests in doing so. That is political reporting. Now, who does that represent?
I don't think you're being quite fair there, actually, because I mean, you know, the newspapers also attack Tory MPs sometimes. I mean,
the Daily Telegraph exposed every Tory MP and all the duck houses and the note cleaning. That was done by the leadings of the Tory group. You can't see it. When it's brilliant, it suits me. And when it isn't brilliant, it doesn't.
It suits you when it's good.
No, but why aren't there more left-wing papers in Britain? Because there aren't more left-wing voters who want to buy them. If there were, you wouldn't just have the Daily Mirror and maybe half an Independent and half the Guardian. We don't have left-wing papers, unlike Paris, for instance.
You don't have a lot of left-wing millionaires to buy them, though. That's what you're saying.
No, I'm not saying that. It's not buying them. People buy papers. The people on the street buy papers, not left-wing millionaires or right-wing millionaires.
But just that not many people buy papers at all anyway. Actually, this is the one question I wanted to put you before we're going to talk about the future.
Oh, but can I tell a joke beforehand?
You can tell a joke, and the question you can combine your joke into your answer. That's the stand-up challenge. Basically, yes. Okay. Well, we had the mentioning of citizen journalism, and we all know how crucial was the role of Twitter and Facebook and all the new media in these revolutions, the summer revolutions, and the organization of these movements around the world, which, from our discussion, seem to have been the most important thing that has happened in the world this year. We are all journalists. I think all of us have been freelance journalists. We're in the field. We're all a bit of hacks, I think, I dare say. What is the influence of all this on our work as journalists? I think, you know, the point Christian and I think some Chris's answers to it are touching on this a little bit. Is this a new world for journalists? Is this a new world for journalism?
Yeah, I think it is. Sometimes feels like a rather unfamiliar world as well. Something like Egypt. The story was so fast moving in Tahrir Square, and I think one of the reasons was because of Twitter and social media. It seems to speed everything up. I think one of the things that we can do as journalists, which the citizen journalists can't do, is we can bring our judgment and our editorial judgment and our interpretation to the story. Perhaps sometimes, especially on a Sunday paper like mine, slow it down a little bit and give people a long read with a bit of, hopefully, a bit of analysis and background. I think what this kind of new technology is doing that's hugely valuable, though, for us, is it's bringing all kinds of images and information out of places like Libya and Libya at the beginning of the uprising, and Syria, and places that are inaccessible. So we're getting a view into some of these places that 10 years ago we simply wouldn't have had.
I think we're forgetting the Soviet Union.
If it would Chris, give me just a second. Can I comment on my question a little bit? If we could just edit this question, what are we for? What are journalists for? Well, you're saying we're there to connect and to give our interpretation.
Well, I think at our best, we can bring that sort of editorial judgment to a story and explain a story in a way that 140 characters on Twitter, can't.
Okay, Chris, in this new world, what are we for?
Well, I think, in a way, I agree with what's been said, that things are moving terribly quickly. But remember the Soviet Union. Remember how news was got out of that extraordinary place. How we led to the collapse of communism and led to the tumbling of the dominoes in Eastern Europe. This is different because, frankly, the Arab world was so up its own rear parts and with its media completely controlled, not by millionaires so much. I don't like the control of millionaires. Mr. Murdoch is not my closest chum after 34 years of cooperation, but nevertheless, it's better Murdoch, better the Barclay twins, than to have the Saudi government telling you exactly what you can print, and pictures of Mr. Mubarak on his 80th birthday, looking as though he was 40, with his airbrushed face and his boot black hair. You know, it was embarrassment. And that's what I think. I think the media's job is to try and squeeze things out in any way possible. I remember a poem being smuggled from the Gure by a Russian poetess, written on a piece of toilet paper, written in this way, and I've seen similar in Northern Ireland, messages from Long Kesh got out by toilet paper disguised in various orifices of people's bodies. There are ways in the past when news has been got out, but the technology has made it mass now. You cannot keep a secret. There, you could try to keep a secret. But can I say one point very quickly about the media, and your phrase, and that is that the media in general has had a pretty terrible time commercially, not only from the terribly effective, private citizens' media, but also because of the economy. I mean, people don't want to advertise. And I must say, I came across something earlier this week, which, as we're all in the media, we do like to see it thrive. And next year, we're going to have what's called the quadrennial effect, which sounds as though it's something by Robert Ludlum, but in fact, it's 4 events that only happen once every 4 years, and they're going to stir huge media interest in advertising. The Olympic Games, the European Football Championships are both coming up, the American presidential election and the American congressional elections. When these come together, there's suddenly an enormous sort of wave of advertising and interest and purchase of space. And I think the media's sort of death door, which a lot of people have seen, and we've all met colleagues who've had their offices closed underneath them. And that's rather why these freelance agencies are surviving so well. But I think we're going to find 2012 helpful in that way. And you've got, don't forget, the 60th anniversary of the Queen, only the first since 1897 when that has been one. And the royal wedding, of course, was an enormous provider of media cash. The cash cow of wills and capitalism was enormous. Plus the fact that Asia, we've got Thailand and Japan, those terrible natural disasters that Tim knows so much about, are slowly being repaired. And those two economies are going to come back perhaps into the feeding position again. And I think, perhaps the old traditional media knocked into shape by the competition with our new, younger colleagues who I agree are absolutely professional. And frankly, if you see the insurance that a British cameraman, has to pay to cover a war, it's prohibitive. It's prohibitive. Whereas, if somebody can get on the streets of Bahrain or Syria with their, bravery plus their telephone, which perhaps, was bought for them by Sheikh Mummy or something, it's different. And in that way, I'm just hopeful that the media isn't dead yet.
Rachel, is the media dead yet? So what are we for?
I think what you've been saying about citizen journalism and the role we play is right to the extent that we can bring old school skills of verification, clarification, analysis to bear on information that is coming up through social media. That being said, social media is an incredible resource that journalists can only benefit from. An amazing source of information, an amazing, the crowdsourcing potential of it is incredible. The ability to, for instance, if you hear something put on Twitter, has anybody else heard this? Is it right? Did you hear something different? The capacity to do that is just extraordinary. And, for me, it's been an enormous benefit, or going to a country and actually connecting with people on the ground through social media. But I do think as well that, we have probably exaggerated the impact of social media with the Arab uprisings. And again, I think that's because we're looking at it through our own filters. We have interviewed people who look like us and speak English and are connected to the internet, who are not the majority of the population, and certainly not the only ones who've been organising and have been a part of this uprising. So I do think these are things to think about and try and sort of pull together in the year ahead.
It was interesting that it as a sign of being progressive. I remember when the young Assad became president, the main emphasis in the media was that he's going to modernize Syria because he's young and modern and he's connected to the internet. This was, and Barbara Walters this week asked him this disappointment, but they said that you were young and connected to the internet. How come you turned out so bad?
And speak fluent English. How can you be, you know, an illiberal tyrant when you speak such fluent English? I mean, it's just inconceivable, wasn't it? But
yeah.
Yes. What are we for?
Well, I think that we may be seeing a kind of, how should I say, a gradual parting of the ways. I mean, I do think that in the future there will be, I mean, as you've been concentrating on kind of immediate hard news, big stories, that's all fine, but increasingly there's less detailed analysis, there's less deep drilling down analysis of information in papers, and I think that will become, that won't go away, but it will become something that you have to pay for. It will become much more specialised, and I think that if you really want to know something about something, you're going to have to pay a lot more than you used to have to pay just for a regular newspaper. So I think that that's something that you kind of not really touched on. I mean, citizen journalism is fine, but it's not going to help you. One of the most important stories, which is going to set the agenda, not only for the next year, but for the next decade in Europe, is what's happening tonight and tomorrow at the European Council in Brussels. And citizen journalism is not going to help you get in. It's not going to help one bit understanding.
Sorry? Neither does anyone else that we
No, I'm afraid nobody
knows
knows
what's
that.
better.
Well, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's completely untrue. No, I know, but I don't. But I think that, you know, the future of Europe, and which may well be decided in the next 48 hours, is going to affect us all. Say, well, citizen journalism is going to.
But also your own magazine, The Economist. I mean, huge rise in the circulation.
Because it's concentrated on, it's invested in journalism, it's invested in going up market, and so many other people had gone down market and chasing the middle. And they tend to
middle.
Yes, squeeze middle, but they've gone up because there's much less competition left up at the top there. But exactly, that's not going to be affected by citizen journalism. But it's going to be increasingly something which is increasingly expensive to do. It's going to be increasingly expensive for people to acquire. And maybe that things will become so much more specialised that it won't be the kind of regular journalism that we're used to, but there'll be kind of much more specialisation, and that will be expensive, and that will be available for people.
But hasn't the taste gone down for these huge chunks? People are. I remember when Time and Magazine here, Time and Newsweek saved themselves by going into smallish. People's mind are influenced in that way by the one, short sound bites and 140 word pieces. The idea of settling down to 3,000 words on the Eurozone is, perhaps not everybody's Sunday afternoon.
It doesn't have to be 3,000 words, but I mean, just in my little patch, if you are, for example, interested in what's happening in a relatively large part of Europe, there's pretty few places where you can go, and so it's becoming more specialised. But I still will only get maybe 500, 600, 700 words a week to do something, or will be online, but that's free online for them. I don't suppose it'll be free in a few years' time. And the fact that they still invest money in expenses and everything to cover that area, there's no particular reason why that should remain free. But it will mean that all of those things, which are not necessarily the big stories, the Tahrir Squares, the Libyas, which are still pretty important to all of us, whether certain bits of the world are not very important to all of us, but as I say, what happens tonight and tomorrow in the European side is very important to all of us. But there'll be less and less there'll be less. How shall I put it? There'll be less of a range of views, and there'll be less accessible information.
Leah, could you tell your joke and tell us
Joke,
about
okay, the joke, and then
tell us what journalism is for you?
I'll do that. But the joke is there was a banker, a teacher, a Tory MP, and a Daily Mail reader sitting around the table. There were 10 biscuits on the table. Now the banker goes off and scoffs 9. The Tory MP that looks at the Daily Mail reader and says, "See that teacher? He's after your biscuit." So there we are. That's the joke. Gong show moment. I am probably the only person here on this panel who's trying to do themselves out of a job. Because one of the main things I like doing, and I'm working with an international NGO that campaigns for human rights about it, is to find a way to collate open source and on-the-ground media in countries, conflict and post-conflict environments, so that people can then centralize it in one database and through a matrix be able to fact-check it with experts and journalists and everybody else, be able to actually cross-reference all of these various events, and then push it out free and as VNR almost to the likes of AP and Reuters and everywhere else as on a pool basis. So that's one of my main projects apart from my channel mission and all that politics. And the other thing is, I'm also no one here has also addressed the dearth of current affairs journalism within television. I don't know if anyone actually is aware of what's happening at the moment in Channel 4, but there is a huge bloodbath going on, particularly in dispatches, particularly because the formats have now been changed from an hour to half an hour. There are certain parts of that I can't really talk about, but I do know that there is a move towards more celebrity journalist-fronted news. So when you saw Jon Snow doing Landlords from Hell, that was only after he went, and he and Krishna Murthy and a few other people went through what's otherwise known as a media training course, so that he can appear much more kind of palatable to the general public. Jon Snow going through a media training course so he can go and front a so-called thing on Landlords from Hell. It's where the actual journalist didn't actually have a hand in anything editorial anymore, and things are going along the lines of, dropping a big hint here, My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding.
But what about radio, where you've got World at 1 increased from 1:30?
Radio's amazing. Radio's absolutely amazing.
Radio's still great.
And one of my favourite things, and one of the reasons why I still do it, is working for Resonance FM, because it's community radio, it's arts-based radio. It allows you to explore and to play and to discuss everything from pensioners go on there to somebody fixing on a bike show to experimental sound art. You can get all of that there. And radio is an amazing, amazing thing, and it's also something you can actually get anywhere in the world. If you have the right long wave frequency or the right medium wave frequency, all you have to do is wind up something and then pick it up in the middle of
It's going on my computer.
Right, I want to end. I want to take you back to the question where we started, which was our headline question. What is the world coming to? Where are we going in the next year? What are the trends, not in journalism, but in the world, from what you've seen? What is the legacy of 2011? What are we going to see in 2012? I know it's a big question, but give us your angle on it. Thank you.
I think it's going to be a very, very interesting year, 2012. I think 2011, for a journalist working in foreign news, what's been amazing about it is the number of gigantic stories that just came out of nowhere. Obviously the tsunami, what happened in Egypt and Libya, journalists weren't expecting it. I think most Egyptians and Libyans weren't expecting it, actually, certainly Libyans weren't expecting it. And gigantic stories as well. I mean, in Britain as well, the riots, with News International, the closure of the News of the World. Just one amazing big story after another, and lurking in the background all the way through has been the Eurozone crisis, which could end up being the biggest of all of them, at least as far as it affects our lives. I'm not sure whether there is a common thread between all these stories. I suppose there's the economy and changes in the economy everywhere. I'm not really. I spoke to a lot of Egyptians and Libyans about why they think their uprisings happen now, and a lot of them don't really know themselves. I suppose food prices, joblessness was a very big part of it. Economic reasons were a big part of it, and I think you do get a sense in the Middle East, in Europe, I'm sure in many other parts of the world, the economic system isn't working like it used to work. There's great pessimism about the future, especially here in Europe. And I think for that reason, we're going to see a lot more unexpected stories in 2012. So I think 2012 is going to be a pretty interesting year.
Well, we don't know what's going to happen. Basically, that's what you're saying.
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, the optimism and excitement of what started as the Arab Spring has become, in some places, a series of rather grinding wars in places like Yemen and Syria. They don't look so hopeful in those places. Things could go really badly wrong. There's the possibility of Iran being bombed. If that happens, well, we could have a very eventful 2012. And then in Europe as well, I'm no economist, but it's obviously the economists themselves don't really understand what's happening most of the time. No one's able to predict it. Maybe the euro will be solved, be saved. Maybe Europe is on the brink of some kind of terrible economic depression, and we know what happened last time in the 1930s when Europe went through an economic depression. So I think it's very hard actually to see, what's going to happen, except the obvious things like the Olympics. But I get a sense that the world really is in flux at the moment. Things are changing. That the economic system isn't working anymore, and that could lead to all kinds of extraordinary changes. Some of them, no doubt, will be traumatic for people. But I think a lot of this is personally, I think a lot of this is quite hopeful. I think we've seen with the banks and the moral corruption of the banks, at least, the ridiculous amounts of money that have been creamed off by bankers. We've seen a lot of that in the past couple of years. If now people are starting to question the economic system, perhaps that will be changed. Perhaps we'll have a better system come of it eventually.
Chris?
Well, the art of prediction is a well-known, very dangerous one to get involved in. The best thing is to tear up the tape and the film next year so you don't start playing it to us. But let's just start with some certainties, and there are very few. There are 3 major presidential elections. Russia, excuse my French, France and America. The American one, above all, I think, could have a big influence later in the year. And earlier in the year, it would mean that America is totally obsessed with its own navel, as they always are when they're rushing towards the polls. France, an incredible effect. Don't forget, it's not beyond at all the power of the polls that Marine Le Pen, who is running actually close to Sarkozy or ahead, they're both behind at present the socialists, but they've lost their leading candidate to a rather sorted sex scandal. That could change everything. I mean, if you suddenly had a big country like France with the extreme right wing in power, repercussions, and then, the third one is, as we talked about earlier, Russia. And, I mean, until perhaps last week, that would have been way down the list. Putin's going to run home. He'll probably be stripped to the waist and dance with a few bombs. But now it's turned out he is also under threat. So I'll leave the others to you. 3 factors are certain. And the thing about the economy is what Tim says is absolutely right. I mean, the thing is, if all of us, or me particularly, were a lot younger now, we'd probably be starting life as an economics reporter. Mr. Editor, can I please go and cover the markets? I don't want to go to Afghanistan You know, it's the new black, isn't it? Robert Peston is Flanders on the BBC, Ismail on the Channel 4. These are the heroes and heroines now of journalism, and it is so unlikely that what happens this weekend is going to do anything but attach a very large piece of elastoplast to a wound that's being fixed. It's not going to be fixed. It may be fixed for months. But I mean, the absolute incontrovertible fact that 17 different economies functioning with one currency cannot, you know, have totally different cultural needs. I mean, you can't stop a German thinking a Greek's lazy because he has a siesta. But on the other hand, you can't stop a Greek thinking a German's a boring sort of guy who sweeps the leaves up in the park on a Sunday. You know, trying to bring these things so closer together. And I'll just end on Britain's role in this. We're suddenly become the outsider. You know, we're almost sort of got our hand up. Please, sir, don't forget us. Can we be part? And I heard a brilliant description of, I thought, Britain's role under Cameron in these, you know, imminent negotiations and those to come. And that is, Britain is like somebody who belongs to a London club, but frankly refuses to pay the annual fees, but nevertheless wants to go to the Christmas party. And that's, you know, the position I think we're in. I just don't think you can see the way we're trying to influence things. So just to add to those 3 presidential elections, Mr. Cameron's really got to watch those baying dogs, the Tories. The Tory party has an absolute history of splitting over Europe. You can't believe it, but when you see William Cush's stiff-necked striding into the TV studio, telling you, you know, that the Europeans will just give us everything back and we'll give them a little bit of a bauble if they want one. I mean, it's out of reality. The British haven't got the power. We haven't even got any weapons. Any aircraft carriers or anything else. We certainly can't start challenging the French and German political, economic and military power.
Rachel, where are we going?
Where are we going? Well, as Tim said, the amount of news we've had this year has been phenomenal. And, you know, you sort of think that we've used up all the news allowance for about 10 years to come, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to have another very news-dense year. The situation in the Middle East is clearly going to roll on. I'm worried about proxy wars in the Middle East. I think there's a very serious risk that the enthusiasm and the hope and the restored dignity of the Arab uprisings will be corralled into some sort of proxy war as players try to reassert an influence in the region. I'm thinking of the US, I'm thinking of Israel, I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia. So those are my concerns, particularly with this kind of Iran demon being flagged up now on what I think are very spurious grounds. But I do think that in the year that we've seen of people trying to reclaim concepts of democracy, we've seen them do that on the streets, Egypt, Tunisia, Greece, Spain, Israel, the States, London, all these movements, people trying to reclaim a sense of democracy. And I wonder if next year, as we watch really an economic system pretty much eat itself, whether we're going to see the reclamation of democracy transposed to reclaiming institutions, reclaiming government, and reclaiming power. So let's see if that happens.
This question makes me think of something that I heard Ivan Krastev, a Bulgarian philosopher and sociologist, say a few years ago. He was born in the 60s, and he said the idea that as he was into adulthood, that one day that everything that he knew, the whole Soviet bloc would just vanish, was just inconceivable. So I think that we should start on that basis. I think the fact is that so much has happened, and the fact that you couldn't a year ago have predicted any of this means that it's foolish to try and predict anything. I mean, I do think that, having said that, I'm not a Middle East expert, but clearly watch Iran. Is there going to be war with Iran? I think that it's inevitable that all revolutions are followed by disappointment. I think that's clearly going to be the case. I imagine that I don't see why that should be any different in Arab countries from anywhere else. I think sectarianism will increasingly play a role. People will be disappointed because revolutions won't create jobs. I wouldn't like to be a Copt in Egypt today. Plenty of Copts are leaving. Will Syria collapse into sectarianism? Well, quite possibly. We saw what happened in Iraq. There's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't happen again in Syria. I think so. What you said about the euro, fine. I take your point, but I think that in a kind of more kind of philosophical sense, what might happen or what appears to be happening in Brussels tonight and tomorrow is actually perhaps the birth of a new Europe in the sense of an institutional two-speed Europe, which is a little bit what you're talking about, and suddenly Conservatives who suddenly don't want anything to do with Europe are suddenly going to find, well, fine, well, you don't have anything to do with it because you just be on the outer, marginal and unimportant ring, and it doesn't really matter what you think, fine. And so absolutely, you can't have it both ways.
Don't ring us, we'll ring you.
Well, yes, and fine, we 17 will make decisions, and if that affects the City of London, well, sorry, well, you're not at the table. So I think that's rather important. Russia increasingly being described as a post-BRIC country. We've seen I don't want to compare. I think that somebody mentioned earlier on what's been happening in Moscow, and the fact that Putin was being booed. I think that in historical terms, that will come to be seen as a sort of key event that people will remember. Not quite as dramatic, for example, as you and I remember the moment that Ceausescu was seen to crack on the balcony in Bucharest, but that is the sort of iconic moment, and will that be the same for Putin? China, nobody's mentioned China and the rise of China, but China has huge demographic problems coming up. It's all very well being a big rising economic power, but one-child policy means that demographics are going to go downhill very fast, very soon. What else have I got on my list? Well, that's probably enough for the moment. Having said that we can't predict the future, and I've just gone ahead and done it, so over to you.
Apart from quite a lot of what's been mentioned about the rise of neoliberalism and a growing sense of poverty in the place, I'm actually quite excited that there is a rise of neoliberalism and poverty, because it just means there's going to be a much more exciting creative output. Listen Gallery is featuring an artist called Santiago Sierra at the end of January, start of February. Fantastic video artist, phenomenally activist, phenomenally creative in what he's managed to do. One of the examples of his work is he deals with, he uses exploitation as an actual material. So he went to the streets of Mexico City, and for the cost of a line of crack, or some crack, he then managed to tattoo on the backs of these crack-addicted prostitutes a line of cocaine, and then took photographs and then exhibited that as incredibly powerful pieces of work. What will happen to Ai Weiwei is something that's also of deep interest to me. Also the rise of artistic collectives, and also the rise of street art, within particularly otherwise known as Arab countries. So somebody called Ganzia in Egypt, a friend of mine called Alone in Tehran, who I've kind of worked with on numerous occasions. It means that you can't really do what Damien Hirst is going to be doing for the Olympics anymore. The Britpack kind of sense of sensation and the 1990s idea of the celebrity artist is going to be shoved out the window in favour of things that are much more performative, much more collective, things like Deviate. And people will experiment more with consume the creative form, because they won't be able to just go off and dick off to a holiday and escape anymore. They'll actually be interested in reading things, writing things, creating things, filming things, making things for themselves. And it's this rise of creativity which I am looking forward to in 2012, 2013.
It might be bad for us, but it's going to be good for the arts.
Fucking brilliant for the arts.
I apologize for that language.
These artists, you know.
Right. While everybody were summarizing the year and looking at the year ahead, I was thinking horrified about all the places that we did not speak about.
Yeah.
And all the stories that we did not speak at all about Africa beyond North Africa.
Chile.
We didn't speak about South America and Chile, and we didn't speak about natural disasters.
Northern Ireland.
Which I was and Northern Ireland. And China and India. So we only had an hour, and I think we've taken an hour and a half. I think it's quite a good time for us to go and have a glass of wine. I just wanted to say two things. First, I want to wish everybody a happy Christmas and New Year and Hanukkah and season, basically. And also, I would like to, I should have done this at the beginning, first to apologize on behalf of our CEO, Henry Pierce, for not being here tonight, but also to congratulate him on all our behalfs for his new daughter, Marta, that was born this week. And I want to thank our panel, Nick Merrill, Chris Walker, Rachel, Shabi, and Tim Judah and Leah Borromeo. I think it was a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much. Have a great year. Is it? Are we allowed?
Very good.
Are you off now?
Yeah,
did I?
Well, it's just on the other side of town. But, yeah, so see you soon. But good to meet you in Iceland. Yeah.
I will get you some.
Hello?
So what did you think?
It was very interesting.
Oh, thank you so much. And talk to me. How long is that thing?
Yeah.